Believe it or not, it's been just about 2 months since the New World preview event happened. The thing kind of came and went like a flash in a pan, and even though I have my criticisms and complaints and concerns for the game, overall, I genuinely enjoyed playing the preview. I sunk in a total of about 50 hours. Suffice it to say, I am still hopeful for the game, and I think it does have potential to be something good, if not great. And just yesterday, we got a pretty major update about some changes coming to New World that address, whether for better or worse, some of the major concerns, specifically around the game's combat. So I want to go over a bit of what this update covers, piece by piece, and give you guys some of my thoughts and impressions about some of these changes as we go throughout. So the update starts off with mentioning that they gathered a ton of data and feedback from the preview event, went back into development, and are actually currently heading forward into alpha testing. Alpha testing is actually underway. It began yesterday, October the 20th, although it is a confidential test, meaning there is an NDA. And as part of this whole process, even though the alpha isn't open to everyone, they are wanting to be transparent with some of the adjustments and changes that they're making. So they went ahead and gave us the patch notes for the most recent update for the game. And this is where we get a ton of information. So the first thing they reveal is that they've added the spear to the game. Is a melee weapon that says to offer both long distance pierce damage and some range capabilities. It's going to scale primarily with dexterity, but also benefits from strength. And they've got two skill trees that they point to. The zoner skill tree that specializes in keeping enemies at a distance and throwing spears from range, as well as the impaler skill tree that specializes in closing the gap and quicker attacks that impart status effects. There's a new weapon coming to the game. More new weapons are coming in the future. That's a good thing overall. I'd like to see more diversity and options in the game in general, and I think adding new weapons and their associated skill trees is a perfectly fine way of doing that. Now, here's probably the biggest thing that people are either going to be very excited about or very upset, depending on how you felt about New World's combat up to this point. So they're adding per weapon cooldowns, or rather, they're removing the cooldowns shared across all of your weapon slots. They say this provides more options in combat and makes weapons selection even more valuable. So now each weapon will have independent cooldowns, meaning that you could use all three abilities on one weapon and then switch to another weapon and use all three of those weapons' abilities. Whereas prior, if I used the Q ability on my hatchet and I switched to my bow, the Q ability would still be on cooldown. It was very, very restrictive, and it made it so that you basically spent a majority of your time in combat, specifically in PvE. I know the PvP crowd and the PvP approach to combat is quite different, but on the PvE side of things, I would use one or two abilities and then just be spamming basic attacks the rest of the time. And the basic attack system in New World isn't exactly intricate or nuanced, so it became a little repetitive and boring over those 50 hours. In addition to the separation of cooldowns amongst each of the weapon slots, weapon switching has now also been sped up, so you can more easily swap between weapons. They've also made it so that you can dodge roll without stamina if you've been struck in multiple consecutive reactions. If you get in the stun lock situation, you're basically going to get a free dodge roll to get out of there. That was a pretty major complaint from people. And then also, if you ever have any abilities interrupted or canceled before the active frames of the attack, they will no longer be put on cooldown. So, if you start an ability but it doesn't complete, it won't go on cooldown as a result. Overall, these are some pretty interesting changes that are gonna really, really change the feel of combat. Again, I know depending on where you fall in the usage of skills versus the usage of basic attacks debate, there's pretty strong camps on both sides. I know especially whenever I go to any of the New World subreddits, it seems like there are a lot of people who are very strong proponents of how it's worked up until this point. They don't want you using skills very often, and they want you to focus on just the essential melee attack system. And whenever that conversation is brought up, I see a lot of comparisons to, well, they do it in Dark Souls, but I just have to say, those comparisons seem a little disingenuous. The combat system in New World is but a pale comparison of the depth and complexity of the melee combat that you get in Dark Souls. I mean, it feels like the people making these comparisons haven't played Dark Souls. I'm not trying to be a jerk about it, but sincerely, there's so much more that you can do in Dark Souls combat system. You've got the alternating between light and heavy attacks. If you do 3 light attacks in a row, it will do a certain attack pattern. If you do 3 heavy attacks, it will do a certain attack pattern. pattern. Then there's the fact that you can alternate light, heavy, heavy, light, light, heavy, 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 light, and any of those combinations will result in a drastically different attack pattern. That's not even including the fact that there are leaping attacks, falling attacks, the parry system, dodging attacks, step back attacks. A lot of the weapons can then be switched from a one-hand to a two-hand or vice versa, which will give you a whole new range of a set of attacks for all of those different inputs that I just mentioned. The melee system in New World is light attack and heavy attack. No special animations for comboing and switching between light and heavy, no dodge light and heavy options, no jumping light and heavy options, no falling light and heavy options, no parry system. It's just, the developers have said that their system was inspired by Dark Souls, but it does not even come close to touching just how intricate it is and how interesting it is. Dark Souls is one of my favorite games of all time, and I can tell you, I don't see the comparison other than the fact that that it's based in this action combat where you're physically having to hit something. Really, the truth is, if New World's combat had even a fraction of the interesting options with all the stuff that I just mentioned, I don't think it'd be as bothersome how the shared cooldown system works, because yeah, if I just had to rely on a straight up Dark Souls melee combat system, I wouldn't care that I couldn't use my skills very often. But in New World, you're most of the time, at least in PvE, the PvP portion is a different thing. There's a different way you approach combat and a different way that you're attacking. But when you're doing PvE in this game, the melee combat is essentially just spamming light attacks, occasionally doing a heavy attack to break through a block, and that's it. And that gets incredibly repetitive over the course of just the 50 hours that I played in the preview event. I think they had to do something to mix it up. This is one potential solution. Who knows if this will be the one that is ultimately the best thing. I think this is part of the reason they're doing the testing. They might end up reverting this if the feedback is overwhelmingly negative and people don't like the fact that, because there's a fair argument on the other side of this coin as well. People don't want it to just be spamming your three abilities, swapping weapons, spanning those three abilities, swapping to your third weapon, spanning those three abilities, and then going back to the first weapon, rinse and repeat. Well, a lot of people don't like that combat, and I think that's a fair complaint. If you want a more focused on the light and heavy attacks and the blocking and the dodging and all of that, it's fair to want that to be the primary focus of combat. I just think New World's problem is there could be a ton more depth to how they handle that non-skill based combat. And I mean the just not using skills, everything else about the combat could be a lot better. And if it were better, I don't think that this would be as big of a concern. I don't think that we'd have to focus on this weapon spam. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. And I know this is going to be a very contentious conversation around this specific thing. But this isn't the only thing that changed. There were some other changes, specifically around balance. So they talk about how they basically nerfed the hatchet into the ground. They reduced the duration of Berserk to 10 seconds. Berserking endurance was also reduced down to 2 seconds. The Call the Weak has been changed into a heavy attack. The rejuvenating kills was reduced down to 5%. Relentless Fury reduced down to 5%. And they also reduced the homing, or essentially the aim assist, on the second and third of the light attacks. They took the hatchet to the hatchet. Dad jokes. Yeah, they really smashed the hatchet into the ground. I think it's probably a fair response, though, given how overwhelmingly popular this weapon was in the preview event, and I think for good reason. There's a lot of things you can point to. Obviously, Berserk was incredibly strong. The fact that you were invulnerable to death during Berserk is very strong, but I think really one of the biggest things that made the weapon consistently good to use was all of the health that you got back every time you killed. I don't remember the exact numerical value, but I swear it was something around 20%. It had to have been around 15 to 20%. It was a significant chunk of health every time you killed a new enemy. And the fact that they're nerfing it all the way down to 5%, that is a massive reduction. It barely noticeable. 5% of your health bar every time you get a kill. It's a very, very small thing. So that is definitely gonna swing the pendulum, I think, in the other direction for the hatchet and get people looking at using some other weapons more frequently. Speaking of weapons, the next one that got a change was the life staff, and I gotta say I understand, but I'm also not happy about this change. So for life staff, they decreased the speed of light distance, which was essentially the blink ability for the weapon, by 50%. 10%. They cut that thing in half, and they also increased its cooldown to 25 seconds. The longer cooldown, I'm not as bothered by. I think nerfing speed of light is a mistake, and the reason why is not because I don't think it was incredibly strong. It was. Come the end of the beta, especially when you got the people who were sticking around and playing a lot, pretty much everyone was using the life staff because it was, frankly, the only good, reliable movement skill in the game. It was the best movement skill, but I don't think making that worse is the answer. I think adding more movement skills and making other existing ones better is the right answer. For example, the fire staff has a blink-like ability, but it's got a cast time. Get rid of that shit. It leaves fire on the ground. It's a shorter distance than the life staff blink. Just make it instant. It's got its fringe benefits. That's one change they can make. There's a jump back ability for the bow. You could just increase that distance, and so people could do the whole camera swivel, leap back. It's a pretty common thing for like archer or rogue type classes to have, and a lot of players of MMOs and RPGs are familiar with that idea. Also, why the hell isn't there any significant charge ability on like the sword and shield or one of the other melee weapons? It baffles my mind that the game doesn't have a charge equivalent. You could also add a leap ability like WoW's heroic leap, for example. There are so many additional movement skills, and I think this just goes back to the fact that I think that there should probably be at least one more skill tree per weapon. Right now there's 2 for every weapon. You should probably have 3. If you want to stick with just 2, fine. Give us more damn abilities, and I think having a movement skill for a lot more of the weapons is the real answer rather than just nerfing the life staff. I don't disagree that the life staff was overtuned and could certainly use some adjustments, but there should just be more movement capabilities in this game in general so people don't have to feel like they need to pick up the healing staff in order to get around the world in a fair fashion or to have a chance in PvP engagements. Also, some adjustments to backstab. I'm not too familiar with this because I believe originally it was just the sword and shield. Any melee attack that hits enemies in the back now gets backstab damage bonus. So now they just made backstab just a mechanic in the game across the board. And also backstabs no longer cause a knockdown effect. I think that's going to be a really big change. And I imagine that a lot of the PvP crowd that use this mechanic is not going to be too happy about that. Here's a big one though. They're adding a threat system. That's right. They say this is part 1 of the threat system implementation. These are adjustments to make enemy targets more understandable and controllable, they say. So they've introduced a threat system where single threat value is calculated per player. Higher threat greatly increases the chance to be selected by the enemy's target. That's just, they described how threat works in RPGs. Great. They're inching closer and closer to having RPG systems. I just hope they have the actual the actual things to do with the end game that incentivize people doing this, because, you know, at the preview event it was just spamming those high-level corrupted breaches, which got kind of old pretty quick, to be perfectly honest. They did have that kind of mini raid thing, but that was very spammy. I don't know. They've got work to do on the end game PvE side. I'll be interested to see what they change for that. So here's some pretty big changes with the economy progression system. So progression changes include reducing the speed of leveling and increasing the relative value of questing XP. So they've reduced the experience players gain from corrupted breaches. Apparently they want to stop people from just farming that, which was a big thing in the preview event. They've also reduced the XP players get from killing creatures. I don't love this change, but as long as they try to keep like the choice of grinding and just questing, if they keep the relative XP per hour somewhat equivalent, I think that's fine. They said as well that they reduced the weapon mastery experience required to level up weapons by 25%, but this was just to compensate for the lower experience gained from killing creatures. And they've also reduced delivery missions experience and rewards. I think it's kind of hilarious that the only changes that they're discussing here to the questing system is basically nerfing quests across the board. They need to do a lot more in the questing system. It is just bare bones. I know that if you boil RPG and MMO questing down to like the brass tacks, they are almost all the same thing. It's like go to an area, interact with an item, or kill some enemies, or stand here. You know, RPG and MMO quest are pretty generic if you really boil them down. But at least with a majority of the successful MMOs out there, and RPGs especially, there is the veneer of something interesting on top of that, and they at least introduce some variety. The questing system in New World is just laughably basic. 90% of the quests that I do in that game are go to this location, interact with 5 to 10 loot crates, or kill 10 to 15 enemies, come back and turn it in. and you just repeat that ad nauseum for the 50 hours that you play, unless you went to farming corrupted breaches, but apparently they're nerfing that. So just make it seem like things are different, even if you're fundamentally doing the same thing, because man, that questing system got incredibly boring and repetitive very quickly. I guess much like spamming light attacks was as well, and I guess they're addressing that. So anyways, here's another big change to attributes. They've increased the attribute pool to add a meaningful amount of gear and introduce diminishing returns to increase build variety. Essentially what that means is they don't want people just dumping points into health or just dumping points into their 1 damage primary stat. They want things to be a bit more diverse, and some of that is going to come through the fact that gear now has attributes. So they've increased the amount of attribute points you get from leveling. They added attribute points to gear. Now gems no longer give attributes and instead provide elemental damage for weapons and family banes for armor, and they've added diminishing returns to all of the attributes to stop people from stacking one attribute too much. There are some gear changes that coincide with this. They've adjusted level requirements and rarity mapping for gear. All of this is in preparation for a strong end game gear chase, they say. And then the final in bit of information here is they've added 16 new perks to the game. 9 of these reduce the weight of a specific class of item, and 7 of these will affect threat generation. And there you go. That is the entire update. So some pretty major things. I think, it's cool that there's a new weapon coming to the game. And then, there's some balance changes as well to the hatchet and life staff and all of that. But obviously the biggest thing here, and I think the biggest point of discussion, is that per weapon cooldown change and the fact that now you don't have to just use 1 or 2 abilities and spam light attacks in PvE. It's so weird because I know that there is certainly a huge PvP crowd. This game was originally a PvP focused game. It was pretty much exclusively a PvP focused game. And I'm sure that how the combat plays out in most PvP is significantly different from how it goes in PvE. But I'll tell you, I was not by any means actively avoiding PvP. I was constantly flagged because I was spending most of my time doing the PvP missions. But in that period of 50 hours that I played the preview event, I would say probably somewhere around 5% of that time was actually being around and engaged in PvP. It was happening very infrequently, and I was constantly flagged. Constantly throughout that entire event. So it's kind of crazy to me. It could just be the server that I was on. Maybe it wasn't populated enough. Maybe there weren't as much of the enemy faction. I don't know the answer, but I'll be interested to see, if anything, because they don't address it here. I'll be interested to see how they try to further incentivize open world PvP and how that crowd reacts to these cooldown changes. Because again, I have seen a pretty vocal group say that they don't like that this is happening. If nothing else, I would say that I am personally intrigued to see how this changes up how the PvE combat feels in the game. This is likely the first of major updates coming as they continue to work on the game. And I know that there's currently this restricted under NDA alpha. We did hear, if memory serves me correctly, that there was supposed to be an additional test similar to the preview event that we had at the end of August. One of those is supposed to be happening again at some point in November. Haven't heard any further word since, and I don't know when and if that's actually going to happen, but I swear they said November there would be another test like the preview event. So hopefully that still commences. I'm excited to check out some of these changes, and I continue to be hopeful for New World despite some of the major issues that it has, and maybe one day I'll actually come out and make that review video. But for now, this is me done rambling about New World. Hope you guys enjoyed this. This went on way longer than I expected. We'll see how the edit comes. All right, thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you later. All right, take it easy.